I think something followed us home. I'll start by saying that I'm writing this on a mobile, so I apologize for any formatting issues. I'm sorry for the length, but I'm trying to put in as much detail as I remember. This story takes place a few years ago when I was in college, but I was reminded of it after a conversation that I had with my sister. One night during summer break a few years ago, my sister and I went to a bonfire at a friend's house. The whole night was nothing out of the ordinary, just some close friends hanging and sitting around a fire. At one point, the fire was dying down a bit, so someone threw a huge piece of cardboard on it. Suddenly, a gust of wind caught the cardboard in a way that caused it to blow upward. I remember looking at the cardboard to make sure that it wasn't about to blow towards me when I noticed that the fire was burning holes that distinctively looked like eyes and a mouth with fire coming out of it. I felt silly, but the way it looked when it burned made me feel uneasy. It started to get late, so I decided it was time to drive home. I was on the last road before I got to my house when my sister and I were talking, and she asked me if I noticed the creepy way that the cardboard burned in the fire. Not long after that, I remember seeing something from the corner of my eye that looked like it was running toward my car tire. I know I wasn't seeing things because my sister gasped, and I ran off the road to avoid what I assume was an animal that was feeling brave or suicidal. We looked out of the windows to see what was there and there was nothing. No sign of anything, and the road we were on didn't give any animals any hiding spots or woods nearby to run into. This freaked me out a little bit, but I could see my house, so I shook it off and pulled into the driveway. I'll never be able to understand what happened when I pulled into that driveway truly. I've never felt primal fear like I did at that moment. Everything inside of me was screaming at me to not walk up to my house. I felt so silly. I've lived in this house for years up until that point. I realized I wasn't crazy when my sister asked me if I felt it too. I looked over, and I could see the terror in her eyes. We couldn't see anything outside, but I could feel evil watching us. We sat in the car, and I tried to play it cool and tell her how crazy we were being and that we need to go inside. Suddenly the lights in my car turned on. I lied and told my sister that I opened my car door a little bit, which caused the lights to turn on, but that was a lie. At this point, I was panicking but trying to play it off to keep my sister calm. We finally get out of the car, and for the first time in our adult lives, we clung to each other like scared children and made our way towards the house. A little bit of backstory: the house in this story has a front porch light that had been out for over a year, but sometimes we would accidentally flip the switch that turns the light on and forget about it since the light didn't work anyway. That night as we were walking up to the house, the light turned on and staring flickering. It's never done that. We pushed through our fear and kept going. We made it to the front steps, and as soon as I hit the first step, my phone started playing at music on full blast. I turned off my music before I got out of the car. I felt like whatever was in front of my house was tormenting us. It wanted to make itself known, and we felt all of it. Walking on that porch into my front door was only a couple of steps, but that night it felt so long. I remember feeling terrified to the point of illness. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to cry, but all I could do was keep my eyes on my front door and walk. I couldn't see it, but I know what I felt was on a specific area of the porch. My sister was closest to that spot, and she later told me about how she could feel something against her as we walked together into the house. The strangest thing was as soon as we walked through the porch and into the house, I immediately felt better. The fear and the feeling of eyes on me and evil just vanished, and everything felt normal. The porch never felt malicious again after that night, and the light never turned back on. I don't know what was on my porch that night, but I know it wasn't good. Scariest shared experience I've ever had. In November of 2017, my new girlfriend, now my wife, and I had only been dating a month when we took our first weekend getaway. We live in southern Illinois and drove about 5.5 hours to Chattanooga, Tennessee to see Ruby Falls, the giant underground waterfall attraction, and Rock City, Lookout Mountain, Both great attractions, but unless you live within 7 hours or are just passing through to another great location for a day or so, I really wouldn't recommend making a family vacation out of it. The area is mostly pretty, and my lady and I, being the stoners we are, of course love a picturesque cityscape, especially when mountains present. Here's looking at you, Denver, Colorado. We were only in Chattanooga for about a day overall, as it was dark out when we got there Saturday evening. We really only had time to go to dinner, enjoy vigorous lovemaking, and smoke a couple joints in the parking lot of the Days Inn that night. Screw tea and weed laws, BTW. The state is full of white trash on meth and way worse shit, but nothing in the American South makes sense to me. I'm recounting this story in early August 2020 during the worst pandemic we will ever see in our lives. The next day we went to the aforementioned attractions, and the last thing we did as it was getting dark soon was go to Rock City, where they have this weird completely dark cave area that is full of glow-in-the-dark fairy tale creatures and classic story characters. It's truly trippy, to be honest. Surreal visual experience. But instead of taking our time looking at the individual sections of the exhibit like we had planned, my wife was now very insistent that we leave Tennessee as soon as possible. She wouldn't tell me what was going on, but something in her eyes said this was all very wrong, and being new to the relationship and not wanting to upset her, I grabbed her hand and we rushed out of there. We grabbed coffee and dinner about halfway back home, when she told me that she felt an evil, angry entity present where we were in the cave exhibit, and that it was so overwhelming negative that we had to leave. While I didn't feel that myself personally, I will say it is a weird place to say the least, so I kind of just dropped it and we made our way back home around 1 a.m. We showered and went to sleep about half an hour later, as we're very tired from the whole weekend of travel. Now here is where the experience actually occurred. About an hour or so after falling asleep, I very suddenly awoke to the very dark feeling of dread, like everything in the world was wrong, and it was the same feeling that I had when I saw my wife's eyes earlier that day in the trippy cave exhibit. I closed my eyes and tried to ignore it when in my mind's eye, I saw, or even now I'll admit possibly imagined, a horribly skinny charred black arm, with a hand that had only 3 fingers with razor-sharp black claws reaching up from under the bed and reaching for my wife. It was so real that my heart started pounding and I absolutely was terrified. That's when my wife let out the most horrifying scream I've ever heard in my entire life, and then she jumped out of our bed and ran for life and was almost to the front door of our apartment when I finally grabbed her and helped her to get control of herself. I've never seen so much fear and horror in the eyes of someone I've loved before. She told me right there was no way we were staying the night at our place that night with what happened, and I agreed. It was very late, but I called my parents, and they let us sleep in the guest room at their house. After I got my wife to calm down and go back to sleep, I privately told my dad what happened and what I saw, and him being the very religious man he is, said that what was attacking was certainly a demon, and the black 3-clawed arm was meant as a mockery to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. This shook and unsettled me. For another 2 years I kept what I saw that night to myself, until when my wife finally brought it up one day and told me she felt something very evil with sharp nails reaching out and grabbing her from under the bed. I finally confirmed my side of the story to her, because up until then she was under the impression that it was her alone that knew what was going that night, and she was mortified when I finally told her. We're both glad we're no longer in that apartment, and we agreed that while we never needed to hear each other's side of the story to know what happened exactly as it occurred that night, it definitely helped us grow as a couple to have that horrible experience. TL, Doctor, after a weekend getaway, I had a vision while lying in bed of my wife being grabbed by a 3-clawed demon, when suddenly she jumped out of bed screaming horribly and ran for the front door of our apartment. We compared stories years later and both felt and experienced the same evil.